The town of Marrow Hollow was the sort of place where people kept to themselves. Not out of malice, but tradition. You didn't ask questions and you didn't open the curtains after dark. It was here, in a sagging two-story house with wind-chimed windows and peeling clapboard, that 9-year-old Evan Drell lived with his mother, Marion. Marion was a quiet woman, brittle with grief after her husband's sudden death 5 winters ago. She had once been warm, sweet-smelling sweaters and sing-song lullabies, but now her movements were mechanical, her eyes always hollow, focused on something beyond the walls. She worked night shifts at the nursing home and left Evan alone most evenings. Evan didn't mind. He was used to it. However, there was always a presence in the house, one the neighbours believed to be Marion's elderly mother-in-law, Irene Drell, who supposedly still lived with them. Irene hadn't been seen in over 4 years, but whenever someone brought her up, Marion would wave it off and say, "Mama keeps to herself these days." No one questioned it. But the Drell house had a smell, a thick, oily rot that crept under doors and seeped through walls. Visitors never stayed long. The truth was, Irene had been dead for years. After the death of her son, Marion's husband, she became unpleasant to deal with. She refused to eat, bathe, or be seen. Eventually, she withered into nothing, and the life left her body. Marion had never told anyone. Her corpse lay upstairs in the locked bedroom, still curled in her yellowed sheets, her mouth frozen in a soundless scream. Flies came and went freely from under the doorframe. Evan knew. But like his mother, he chose not to speak of it. They simply pretended she wasn't there. As pretending someone was alive and keeping to themselves made them less dead, less smelly. Then, unexpectedly, Marion, herself, died. On a cold Sunday morning. A heart attack, they said. She had collapsed on the kitchen floor, her fingers still curled around a mug that once held tea. Evan found her when he came down for breakfast. The tea spilled and dried into the cracked stone floor. Marion's funeral was small. Only a handful of co-workers, a neighbour or two, and Miss Carter, the school counsellor, attended. Evan was already a troubled child. She feared this would worsen his condition greatly. That day, she silently vowed to keep an eye out for the young boy. Evan didn't cry. He stood beside the casket, in his too small suit, his hands stuffed into his pockets, staring blankly at the polished wood. When it was time to lower Marion's casket into the ground, Evan stepped close and whispered something only he and his mother's corpse could hear. Afterward, people assumed he would be taken in by his grandmother, who most also assumed didn't attend the funeral because of the strained relationship with Marion she once openly spoke of. That was what the young boy let them believe. By the time the school called to inquire as to why Evan hadn't attended his classes in over a week, suspicions that no one dared speak out loud had already risen. Miss Carter made the call herself. A voice answered on the 3rd ring. It was Evan's. "She's busy," he said. "She doesn't like the phone anymore." When she asked, "Your grandmother?" he simply hung up. Inside the house, Evan was the one who had been busy. In the basement, amid old canning jars and rusted tools, propped on an old wooden chair, under a bare, flickering light bulb, sat a rotting corpse. Crudely assembled, grotesquely human. The face was held together with what looked like industrial staples. The hair was dark and curly, tangled and dry. Locks had fallen to the basement floor, the eyes black and glassy, her limbs poorly sewn in place. Her right arm was on the left and her left on the right, and she was coated in varnish in an attempt to preserve her rotting flesh. He had robbed Marion from what was meant to be her final resting place, in pieces. Evan would sit on the floor for hours, speaking to her, telling her about his day, about the girls who picked on him, the math teacher who didn't like him, the counselor who was always watching him. He told her about the ache in his chest when she died. He told her how much he missed her hand stroking his hair as he fell asleep. He told her, "I love you, Mother." Mother whispered back in a thin, "I love you too, my baby." From that night on, Evan was changed. He stopped leaving the house. He covered the windows in newspaper. The smell of rot began to seep through the floorboards. The upstairs bedroom door, where Irene's body still rested, never opened, but sometimes it thumped quietly at night, as if something behind it had begun to stir. When the landlord knocked about the rent, no one answered, but he swore he heard crying, no, singing, from inside, a melodic hum. A whole 2 months had passed since the death of Marion, when Ms. Carter had finally convinced the sheriff to do a wellness check. The two of them immediately made their way to Evan's home. They knocked several times with no answer. However, the sheriff found that the front door was unlocked, so they entered. "Evan!" called the sheriff, but there was no response. The air inside the house was dense. It reeked of rot, mildew, and the coppery scent of old blood. They could hear a faint song traveling up from the basement, so they followed the sound, Ms. Carter as close to the sheriff's back as could be, until they found Evan. He was sitting beside the corpse, stroking its hair. His eyes were wide and dry, pupils dilated. There was blood stained into his clothes and wiped across his dirty face. On the wall behind him, written in what looked to be charcoal, were the words, "Welcome home, Mother." "Evan," Ms. Carter whispered. He didn't move. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "She doesn't like visitors." "What is that, Evan?" she asked, voice trembling as she stared at the monstrosity in the chair. "Mother, I made her stay. She tried to leave, but I made her stay. She's my real mom now," he said softly. "She loves me more than she used to." Suddenly, the corpse turned to look at her guests, and they jumped back. Ms. Carter shuddered out loud. No one lives in the Drell house anymore. It's been boarded up, though the upstairs window sometimes shows a faint flicker of movement. Children dare each other to knock at the door. Sometimes they hear it knock back. Sometimes they hear singing or humming. And upstairs, still curled in her bed, grandmother smiles.